When I was a small boy, my father would take me each year around the battlefields of the First World War, the conflict which H.G. Wells called the war to end all wars. My father, much older than my mother, was a soldier of the Great War, fighting in the trenches of France because of a shot fired in a city he'd never heard of called Sarajevo. And when he died 13 years ago at the age of 93, I inherited his campaign medals. One of them, for the 1914-18 war, depicts a winged victory, and on the obverse side are engraved the words, "The Great War for Civilization." So the title is chosen with some irony. To my father's deep concern and my mother's stoic acceptance, I've spent much of my life in wars. They too were fought for civilization. In Afghanistan, I watched the Russians fighting for their international duty, though of course that's what it said on the gravestones, in a conflict against what they called international terror, which might seem faintly familiar to you. Their Afghan opponents, of course, were fighting against communist aggression, and for Allah. I reported from the front lines as the Iranians struggled through what they called the imposed war, which was the invasion by Saddam Hussein in 1980, who called it the Whirlwind War. I've seen the Israelis twice invading Lebanon and then reoccupying the West Bank, in order, so they claimed, to purge the land of terrorism. I was present as the Algerian paramilitary police went to war with Islamists for the same ostensible reason, torturing and executing their prisoners with as much abandon as their Islamist enemies. Then in 1990, Saddam invaded Kuwait, and the Americans sent their armies to the Gulf to liberate the emirate and impose a New World Order. Remember the New World Order? It's a little bit in the past now. In the desert, I always wrote those words, New World Order, in my notebook with a little question mark in the margin. In Bosnia, I found Serbs fighting for what they called Serb civilization, while their Muslim enemies fought and died for a fading multicultural dream and to save their own lives. On a mountaintop in Afghanistan, I sat opposite Osama bin Laden in his tent as he uttered his first direct threat against the United States, pausing as I scribbled his words into my notebook by paraffin lamp. God and evil were what he talked to me about. I was flying over the Atlantic on September the 11th, 2001. My plane turned round off Ireland, of course, when the Americans closed their airspace. And so less than 3 months later, I was in Afghanistan, fleeing with the Taliban down a highway west of Kandahar as America bombed the ruins of a country already destroyed by war. I was in the United Nations General Assembly exactly a year later when George Bush talked about God and weapons of mass destruction and prepared to invade Iraq. The first missiles of that invasion swept over my head in Baghdad. Thus was President Bush's calamitous war on terror given in advance its own supposedly moral foundations. The direct physical results of all these conflicts will remain and should remain in my memory until I die. I don't need to read through my mountain of reporters' notebooks to remember the Iranian soldiers on the troop train north to Tehran, holding towels and coughing up Saddam's gas in gobs of blood and mucus as they read the Quran. That was the day Donald Rumsfeld went to see Saddam and asked to reopen the US embassy in Baghdad. I need none of my newspaper clippings to recall the father, after an American cluster bomb attack on Iraq in 2003, who held out to me what looked like half a crushed loaf of bread, but which turned out to be half a crushed baby. Or the mass grave outside Nasiriyah, in which I came across the remains of a leg with a steel tube inside and a plastic medical disc attached to a stump of bone. Saddam's murderers had taken him straight from the hospital, where he had his hip replacement, to his place of execution in the desert. I don't have nightmares about these things, but I remember. The head blasted off the body of a Kosovo-Albanian refugee during an American air raid 4 years earlier, bearded and upright in a bright green field as if a medieval axeman had just cut him down. The corpse of a Kosovo farmer murdered by the Serbs, his grave opened by the UN so that he re-emerged from the darkness, bloating in front of us. The Iraqi soldier at Fao during the Iran-Iraq war, who lay curled up like a child in the gun pit next to me, black with death, a single gold wedding ring glittering on the third finger of his left hand, bright with sunlight and love, for a woman who did not know she was a widow. Soldier and civilian, they died in their tens of thousands because death had been concocted for them. Morality hitched like a halter around the warhorse, so that we could talk about target-rich environments and collateral damage, that most infantile of attempts to shake off the crime of killing, and report the victory parades, the tearing down of statues, and the importance of peace. Governments like it that way. They want their people to see war as a drama of opposites, good and evil, them and us, remember? Victory or defeat. But war is primarily not about victory or defeat, but about death and the infliction of death. It represents the total failure of the human spirit. I know an editor, mine actually, who has wearied of hearing me say this, but how many editors have first-hand experience of war? One new phenomenon I've noticed recently, maybe you've picked it up, when news cameramen can actually film what they want in wars, which is rare, they can film the most appalling scenes. I remember the British ITN crew who were with me filming a scene on the so-called Road of Death north of Basra in 1991, and dogs, it was lunchtime, dogs were tearing the corpses of Iraqi soldiers to pieces and dragging bits of them off to eat. And they filmed it. I said, why are you filming that? You'll never get it on television. He said, just for the archives. Now, the strange thing is that in a feature film, Saving Private Ryan, Kingdom of Heaven, you can see these things at the cinema or on television. But when it's real, good taste by editors in London or Canberra or Washington prevent you from seeing the reality of war. And in that way, I think television is lethal, because if you saw what I see, you would never, ever support a war. Being a Middle East correspondent is a slightly obscene profession to follow in such circumstances. If the soldiers I watched decided to leave the battlefield, they would, many of them, be shot for desertion, or at least court-martialed. The civilians among whom I was to live and work were forced to stay on under bombardments, their families decimated by shell fire and air raids. As citizens of pariah countries, there would be no visas for them. But if I wanted to quit, if I grew sick of the horrors I saw, I could pack my bag and fly home business class, a glass of champagne in my hand, always supposing, unlike too many of my colleagues, I hadn't been killed. Which is why I cringe each time someone wants to psycho-babble about the trauma of covering wars, the need to obtain counselling for us well-paid scribes, that we may be able to come to terms with what we've seen. No counselling for the poor and huddled masses that were left to Iraq's gas, Iran's rockets, the cruelty of Serbia's militias, the brutal Israeli invasions of Lebanon, the computerised death suffered by Iraqis during America's 2003 invasion of their country. I don't like the definition war correspondent. It's history, not journalism, that has condemned the Middle East to war. I think war correspondent smells a bit, reeks of false romanticism. It has too much of the whiff of Victorian reporters who would view battles from hilltops in the company of ladies, immune to suffering, only occasionally glancing towards the distant pop-pop of cannon fire. Yet war is, paradoxically, a very powerful, unique experience for a journalist, an opportunity to indulge in the only vicarious excitement still free of charge. If you've seen the movies, why not experience the real thing? I fear that some of my colleagues have died this way, heading to war on the assumption that it's still Hollywood, that the heroes don't die, that you can't get killed like the others, that they'll all be Humphrey Haverstocks with a scoop and the best girl. But you can get killed. In just 1 year in Bosnia, we lost 38 reporters. When I first set out to write my new book, I intended it to be a reporter's chronicle of the Middle East over almost 3 decades. But as I prowled through the shelves of papers in my library, more than 350,000 documents and notebooks and files, some written under fire in my own hand, some punched onto telegram paper by tired Arab telecommunications operators, many pounded out on the clacking telex machines we used before the internet was invented, I realised my book was going to be more than a chronology of eyewitness reports. My father, the old soldier of 1918, read my account of the Lebanon War, but would not live to be able to read this book. I'm sorry about that, because this book is partly about the need to refuse the narrative of history laid down to us by our masters, the need to challenge, and also the need to refuse to obey orders. I say that because my father, at the end of the First War, was ordered to execute an Australian soldier by firing squad. The soldier in question, his name was Frank Hills, and he came from Melbourne. And he made the big mistake of joining the British Army after he was invalided out of Gallipoli, where he served with the Aussies. He killed a British military policeman in Paris. My father was ordered to execute him. He was, like my father, 19 years old. And my dad, who was a very right-wing man, he liked magistrates, capital punishment, he said no. Of course, the poor Australian was executed by someone else. But my father said no. And that's partly what my book is about. My father would always look into the past and tell me to understand the present. If only the world had not gone to war in 1914. If only we had not been so selfish in concluding the peace. We victors promised independence to the Arabs and support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And promises are meant to be kept. And so those promises, and the Jews naturally thought that their homeland would be in all of Palestine, were betrayed. And the millions of Arabs and Jews of the Middle East are now condemned to live with the results. In the Middle East, it sometimes feels as if no event in history has a finite end, a crossing point, a moment when we can say, stop, enough, this is where we will break free. I think I understand that time warp. My father was born in 1899, in the century before last. I was born in the first half of the last century. Here I am, I tell myself, in 1980, watching the Soviet army invade Afghanistan. In 1982, cowering in the Iranian front line opposite Saddam's legions. In 2003, observing the first American soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division cross the Jumhuriya Bridge over the Tigris River. And yet, the Battle of the Somme opened just 30 years before I was born. Bill Fisk was in the trenches of France only 28 years before my birth. I would be born within 6 years of the Battle of Britain, just over a year after Hitler's suicide. I saw the planes returning to Britain from Korea, and I remember my mother telling me in 1956 that I was lucky, that had I been older, I would have been a British conscript invading Suez. If I feel this personally, it's because I've witnessed events which over the years can only be defined as an arrogance of power. The Iranians used to call the United States the centre of world arrogance, and I used to laugh at this. But I've begun to understand what it means. After the Allied victory of 1918, at the end of my father's war, the victors divided up the lands of their former enemies. And in the space of just 17 months, they created the borders of Northern Ireland, Yugoslavia, and most of the Middle East. And I have spent my entire career in Belfast and Sarajevo and Beirut and Baghdad watching the people within those borders burn. America invaded Iraq not for Saddam Hussein's mythical weapons of mass destruction, which had long ago been destroyed, but to change the map of the Middle East, much as my father's generation had done more than 80 years earlier. But my book, it turned out, and all my researches were very much about torture and executions. Perhaps our work as journalists does open the door of the occasional cell. Perhaps we do sometimes save a soul from the hangman's noose. But over the years, there's been a steadily growing deluge of letters, both to myself and to the editor of The Independent, and even phone calls to me in Beirut, in which readers, more thoughtful and more despairing than ever before, plead to know how they can make their voice heard when democratic governments seem no longer inclined to represent those who elected them. How, these readers ask, can they prevent a cruel world from poisoning the lives of their children? How can I help them? A British woman living in Germany wrote to me after The Independent published a long article of mine about the raped Muslim women of Gatsko in Bosnia, women who had received no international medical aid, no psychological help, no kindness 2 years after their violation. I suppose in the end we journalists try, or should try, to be the first impartial witnesses to history. If we have any reason for our existence, the least must be our ability to report history as it happens so that no one can say, we didn't know, nobody told us. Amira Hass, the brilliant Israeli journalist on Haaretz newspaper, whose reports on the occupied Palestinian territories have outshone anything written by non-Israeli reporters, discussed this with me more than 2 years ago. I was insisting, being a Brit, that we had a vocation to write the first pages of history. But she interrupted me. No, Robert, you're wrong, she said. Our job is to monitor the centres of power. And I think that's the best definition of my job, journalism, I've ever heard. Especially so when governments and politicians take us to war, when they have decided that they will kill and others will die. But can we perform that task? I still don't know the answer. My life as a journalist has been a great adventure, and it still is. An increasingly dangerous one, I might add. Yet looking through all the months of writing, with all the accounts of pain and injustice and horror, the sins of fathers are visited upon the children. It turned out that my book was also about genocide. I used to argue, hopelessly I'm sure, that every reporter should carry a history book in his back pocket. In 1992, I was in Sarajevo, and once, as Serb shells whiffled over my head, I stood upon the very paving stone where Gavrilo Princip stood as he fired the fatal shot that sent my father to the trenches of the First World War. And of course, the shots were still being fired in Sarajevo when I was there in 1992. It was as if history was a gigantic echo chamber. That was the year in which my father died. How did we go from that titanic war, the war of 1914-1918, through the making of the Middle East, through the Second World War, through the Arab-Israeli wars, through such a vault of historical tragedy, and reach Iraq? Highway 8 is the most dangerous road in Iraq. It is littered with smashed and burned out American trucks and police cars blown up by rocket-propelled grenades. Those who tell you that things are getting better, that the West controls Iraq, should take Highway 8. Every government checkpoint was abandoned. Insurgents swarmed through the villages to the east. This is kidnap country and throat-cutting country. Highway 8 is a symbol of the collapse of all our dreams. But as I was standing by the road one day, talking to an Iraqi family, I was searching for the location of a Red Cross car whose driver had just been murdered, the ground began to move under my feet, and a long, roaring beast of sound came up the road. And from far to the south, a cloud of grey smoke was powering up into the sky, 1,000 exhausts turning the sun dark. The biggest military convoy I've ever seen in my life. The Americans were changing their brigades, the largest military movement since the Second World War. A 40-mile trail of armour and men moving up Highway 8 towards me. With the Iraqis, I sat in the muck at the side of the road. This I had to watch. This I had to absorb, I thought, if I was to understand our new war. Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, Humvees, hundreds of trucks, with thousands of lean young men in battle dress, wearing shades, pointing their rifles into the dangerous countryside. Porcupine quills they reminded me of along the sides of each lorry, hour after hour of them. Apache helicopters, 6 of them, swooping along the road, turning like giant rodents and switching back in the other direction. The soldiers didn't bother to look up. They glanced at us, a few of them, at the Englishmen and the Iraqis sitting in the dirt as these 20th century crusaders drove up to their great concrete walled fortresses on the Tigris, deep into the wilderness of occupation. And I did, I think, begin to understand. 2,000 years ago, a little bit more to the west in Lebanon, I would have been sitting by the roadside as the ground shook to the tramp of Roman legions. Now we live in the American Empire. Yes, this war was about oil. After all, if asparagus or carrots had been the national export of Iraq, I don't think we would have been there. Yes, it was fueled by folly and arrogance and lies. But it was also, I think, about the desire, the visceral need to project power on a massive scale, based on neoconservative fantasies, no doubt, but unstoppable and inexorable. Our army can go to Baghdad, so we will go to Baghdad. And we shall flood across Samaria and all the caliphates and the place where civilization allegedly began. As I go through my words today, and I look through the record of the last 2.5 years on Iraq, the insurrection takes on a savage, epic quality. In Baghdad now, many reporters practice what I call hotel journalism, hiding in their rooms, ordered by their own security men, armed, of course, to avoid the swimming pool. Using Iraq's deteriorating mobile phone system to talk to the Americans and British marooned in their own fortress across the Tigris, behind the concrete and machine gun embrasures of what was Saddam's presidential palace. Patrick Coben of The Independent and myself and several other journalists do still move around Baghdad in private cars with Iraqi friends, even travelling the murderous airport road. But we do so quietly, quickly, often hiding behind an Arabic language newspaper, peeking out the window, stopping only for a minute after a suicide bombing to look at the carnage, the severed heads, one quick word with a witness and back in the car before the crowd comes over to you. Mouse journalism. Now the military rulers of New Iraq have to be helicoptered from their compound to the airport. They can't use the airport road. We have to, though. And from their castle, all they can see of the country they rule is through the gun slits of their own defences. We're talking about the Iraqi government and the civil servants and the American diplomats and the British diplomats. You know, a few weeks ago I travelled with a builder friend of mine from Ireland up to the castle, the Chateau of Saint-Gilles, a great Crusader castle at Tripoli in northern Lebanon. And I said to him, tell me how they built it. Tell me as a builder what you think about the Crusader castles. And he said, well, basically they're churches with defences built onto them. And then we went to the top, and he said, do you know something, Robert? You can't look over the top of the wall because they were so afraid of arrows. And we knelt down and looked through the arrow slit, and I saw a bit of a mosque and a road and a woman walking on it. That was all the Crusaders saw of the lands they occupied and held. And we are exactly the same now in Baghdad. But we're also Crusaders who are blind to reality. George W. Bush and Tony Blair, and indeed your own dear Mr. Howard, still claim that the war is going well. Tens of thousands of Iraqis have been killed and are still being killed. Walmart suicide bombers blow themselves up at the rate of 2 or 3 a day. Remember, when the Hizbollah were fighting the Israelis in southern Lebanon, we'd be shocked to see 1 suicide bombing a month. When the Palestinians were in conflict with the Israelis, their suicide bomber executioners, because that's what they are, because they see the children they're going to kill, it would be 1 a week, and we were amazed. Now in Iraq, if there are 7 suicide bombings a day, we find it normal. Don't ask me how this happens, but some phenomenon is happening which we do not understand. Corpses are found by the dozen on the banks of the Tigris or dumped on Baghdad garbage tips. Foreigners are kidnapped and decapitated on tape. No weapons of mass destruction were ever discovered, nor any links, of course, between Saddam and September 11th. Yet the war is going well. A second war against terror has now started, according to Mr. Blair, as he said this to astonished reporters. Iraq is on the road to democracy after national elections. Democracy is blossoming across the Middle East, or so we are supposed to believe. Each morning in Baghdad, I usually visit the mortuaries. You want to know how many people died? Go and count the bodies. One Monday, about 3 weeks ago, there were 9 corpses brought in. We're talking about death by violence, not heart attacks or people who die of old age. 9 corpses have been brought in by 9 o'clock. By 12 o'clock, there were 26. When the Americans bring bodies to the mortuary, the attendants are not permitted to carry out autopsies, and I still haven't found out why. Outside, the relatives of the dead shriek and weep and swoon with sorrow and curse the Americans, even if their loved ones were killed in family feuds or revenge attacks. The Americans and the British keep no lists, of course, of the Iraqi dead. We only mourn our own sacrifices. 1,900 Americans and more. It'll be 2,000 soon. In the Baghdad mortuary on one day last month, I managed to discover a computer which showed me precisely the figures of violent deaths for the city of Baghdad alone in just July, and the figure was 1,100, the highest ever experienced in the medical centre in Baghdad. Now extrapolate that across Baquba, Fallujah, Ramadi, Kirkuk, Basra, Najaf, Nasiriyah. You're talking of doubling that figure, or trebling it, each month. 3,000, that's 36,000 a year. And people say that 100,000 since the beginning of the invasion is an exaggeration. I doubt it. How did it start, the beginning of the end? In Fallujah, only days after the occupation began, soldiers of the 82nd Airborne opened fire on a crowd of Iraqi Sunni demonstrators, killing 17 of them. They said they'd come under fire, but reporters who reached the school in which the troops were billeted could find no bullet holes. The demonstration was the people wanted the school back. The insurgency started within hours. The city would later be taken over by Iraq's ferocious resistance, along with Ramadi, and whole provinces of Iraq would fall and have fallen under the control of insurgents. So the Americans invaded Fallujah again, for the 3rd time, and fought their way over the rubble of the ruined city. We have won, victory. After Paul Bremer arrived as America's proconsul, he it was who was to appoint the former CIA agent Ayad Alawi as the first interim prime minister. He will call the insurgents, you may remember this, they were called dead-enders, diehards, Saddam's remnants. Blah. All it would need was the capture of Saddam himself and the rebellion would end. Ha, ha, ha. He was wrong. I remember working out what was going to happen once when a young, angry Iraqi in Ramadi, whose family had just been shot at an American checkpoint, came up to me and said, "The resistance came to my house last night and asked me and my brother to join, but I refused. And the reason," he said, "was if we drive the Americans out, we'll get Saddam back again. But if they eliminate Uday and Qusay, the 2 horrible sons of Saddam, and Saddam, I will kill Americans myself." You see the logic. And the Americans did kill Saddam's awful sons, Uday and Qusay, in Mosul. And then inevitably they found Saddam in a hole in the ground. "Ladies and gentlemen, we got him," Brahma crowed. "This is a great day in Iraq's history." Oh, yes, indeed. December the 13th, 2003 was supposed to be the end of the insurrection, you see. After this, why would anyone bother to fight the occupiers of Iraq? Unkempt, you'll remember, tired eyes, betraying defeat. Even the $750,000 in cash found in his hole in the ground demeaned Saddam. Soon he will be produced in a secret court in chains. He looked in that extraordinary first videotape, I thought, like one of those barbarian prisoners captured in ancient Rome. And there was a kind of satisfaction, driving up to Al-Dwar on the Tigris River in northern Iraq, to arrive at the orange orchard where he was discovered, and to climb as I did into his very little hole in the ground. I lay down inside it. 7 months earlier, I'd seen his red velvet presidential throne in the greatest of all his marble palaces. Did I sit on it? Of course I did. And so here I was, lowering myself into the damp, dark and grey concrete interior of his final retreat. The midget bunker buried beside the Tigris, all 8 feet by 5, I guess, and as near to an underground prison as any of his victims might imagine. Instead of chandeliers, there was just a cheap plastic fan attached to an air vent. Ozymandias came to mind. This, after all, was where his hopes finally crumbled to dust, and it was cold. To climb inside this most famous of all bolt holes, and this, remember, was no Führer bunker with SS guards and switchboards and secretaries taking down last words for posterity. To climb inside, I had to sit on the wooden entrance level and swing my legs into a narrow aperture and find my footing on 4 stairs made of earth. You used your arms to lower yourself into this last remnant of Iraqi Ba'athist history. Then you were sitting on the floor. No light, no water, only the concrete walls and an earthen ceiling above you. Yet above this sullen underground cell was a kind of paradise of thick palm fronds and orange trees dripping gold with mandarins, thickets of tall reeds, the sound of birds buried in the treetops. There was even an old blue-painted boat tucked away behind a wall of fronds, the last chance of escape across the silver Tigris if the Americans closed in. So what, I wonder, did Saddam discover here in the last days? Peace of mind after the years of madness and barbarity? A place to reflect on his awesome sins, how he took his country from prosperity through foreign invasion and isolation and years of torture and suppression into a world of humiliation and occupation. The birds must have sung in the evening, the palm fronds above him must have clustered against each other in the night, but then there must have been the fear, the constant knowledge that betrayal was only an orchard away. It must have been cold in that hole. And no colder when the hands of Washington the All-Powerful reached out across oceans and continents and came to rest on an odd-looking pot plant and pulled it to one side and hauled the caliph out of his hole in the ground. But there was one other conclusion which every Iraqi I spoke to agreed with. The bedraggled, pathetic man with the dirty hair living in a hole in the ground with 3 guns and cash as his cave companions. This man was not leading the Iraqi insurgency against the Americans. If more and more Iraqis were saying before Saddam's capture, like the man in Ramadi, that the one reason they would not join the resistance to US occupation was the fear that if the Americans withdrew, Saddam would return to power, well, that fear had now been taken away. Saddam was gone. So the nightmare was over, was it? And the nightmare was about to begin, for both the Iraqis and for us. I remember an American search operation in Baghdad just after Saddam's capture, all door-kicking and screaming, and just a few metres away I found a message newly spray-painted on a wall. Not by hand, but in a stencil, in poor English perhaps, but there were dozens of identical messages stencilled onto the walls for the occupiers. American soldiers, it said, run away to your home before you will be a body in a black bag, then be dropped in a river or valley. I go back and forth through my notes. May 2003, only a month after the Americans entered Baghdad. I first asked then in The Independent, isn't it time we call this a resistance war? I predicted the insurgency when US forces first entered Baghdad, but the speed with which the Americans found themselves fighting off a growing army of fighters was astonishing. In 5-6 months, a guerrilla war might have started, but a month? Listen to this. 2 Americans shot dead, another 9 wounded by unidentified gunmen in Fallujah. 2 US military policemen badly wounded by a rocket-propelled grenade at a North Baghdad police station. A grenade thrown at American soldiers near Abu Ghraib. That was the toll of violence for just one day after the liberation, May 27th, 2003. Not counting the Muslim woman who approached US troops with a hand grenade in each hand, was shot down before she could throw one of them, and then, as she tried to hurl her second grenade from the ground, was finally killed by the Americans. Even then, most people in Baghdad were receiving only 2 hours electricity a day. The petrol queues in a country whose oil fields had already been corralled by the US military, along with the lucrative clean-ups and all the other American companies moving in on it, stretched for up to 2 miles. Children were being withdrawn from newly opened schools after a mass of child kidnapping and rape. The police stations, now guarded by US troops, have been turned into blockhouses, surrounded by armour and guards with heavy machine guns in lookout posts draped in camouflage netting and surrounded by concrete walls. Baghdad is now becoming a city of walls, 20 feet high, running for mile after mile along highways and shopping streets and the Tigris River. We Westerners are on the run. Caged inside the marble halls of Saddam's finest palace, thousands of American officials and civil servants and Iraqi ministers are still trying to conjure up Rumsfeld's dream of the new Iraq, but they are cut off from their 5 million fellow Baghdadis. Iraq's cities have now become hunting grounds for thieves and rapists. Its even older cities, the great archaeological treasures of Samaria, were left unguarded, and so now an army of robbers has moved in to smash their way through buried treasures 3,000 years old to get at the older ones, turning the ancient sites into a land of craters. It looks sometimes when I go to see these places as if a B-52 has done a carpet bombing operation. After an international outcry following the theft of treasures from the Baghdad Museum, Washington sent an FBI CIA team to investigate the robberies. Now, we've been told, we've got most of the artifacts back. It's okay. Let me give you the real figures. In all, 15,000 objects were looted from the Baghdad Museum. Despite all the fanfare by the Western authorities, 11,000 are now still missing, or were in June of this year, including the famous 3,500-year-old Mona Lisa ivory depicting the head of an Assyrian woman. Of the 4,000 artifacts discovered, 1,000 were found in the United States, 1,067 in Jordan, 600 in Italy, and the remainder in countries neighbouring Iraq. But the post-war tearing apart of the Sumerian cities is at an infinitely greater scale. Historians may one day conclude that this mass destruction of mankind's inheritance is among the most lasting tragedies of the Anglo-American liberation of Iraq. Watching America's awesome control over this part of the world, its massive firepower, its bases and personnel across Europe, the Balkans, Turkey, Jordan, Kuwait, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Bahrain, Doha, Oman, Yemen, Israel, of course, and now Iraq, you can see how the Iraqis thought it through. A generation of teenagers crucified in the 8-year war with Iran had grown up knowing nothing but suffering and death. What did their lives count now? And if the Sunnis among that generation should ever become allied with Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, what destruction might they sow among the Americans and any who chose to help them? A reborn Iraqi army of the shadows, forged in the greatest of all Middle East wars, and an army of suicide bombers. This would be an enemy to challenge any superpower. Let me tell you a little story now. 5 weeks before the American invasion of 2003, Osama bin Laden made another of his boring audio tapes. And as usual, the Western reaction, the CIA reaction, the American government reaction, the journalist reaction, is it him? When was it made? Is he still alive and where is he? And as usual, we didn't read or listen to what he said. I'm going to read, for this book I got a transcript of everything bin Laden had said. And this is what he said 5 weeks before the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I'll do the translation from the English into English. It is beyond doubt that the Crusader War, he's talking about the war that's coming, is first and foremost directed against the family of Islam, irrespective of whether the Socialist Party and Saddam survive or not. It is incumbent on Muslims in general, and specifically those in Iraq, seriously and in the manner of jihad to roll up their sleeves against this tyrannical campaign. He knew the war was coming. He was right. Saddam didn't believe it at this stage. Furthermore, this is bin Laden, they, the Muslims, are duty-bound to accumulate stocks of ammunition and weapons. Despite our belief in our proclamation concerning the fact that socialists are infidels, in present-day circumstances, there is a coincidence of interests between Muslims and socialists, he means the Ba'ath Party, in their battles against the Crusaders. Socialists are unbelievers, wherever they may be it in Baghdad or Aden. But there's a common interest. You see, what he was saying is there will be an insurgency, and Al-Qaeda and the Iraqi Ba'ath Party can fight it together. That is how it all came about. And we missed it. Nobody spotted what bin Laden said. And it was there for all of us to see if we wanted to. We chose not to, of course. And the United States responded in the way of all occupation armies. Its prison camps became places of shame. Prisoners, 11,300 by May of 2003 alone, were routinely beaten during interrogation. We had killings of prisoners at Bagram in Afghanistan. We like to think we only began to discover this when the vile photographs of Abu Ghraib, of course there are going to be a few more shortly, were revealed to the world in 2004. But in my files, I discovered that my colleague Patrick Coburn and I had been writing about torture and prison abuse in the late summer of 2003. Sources may be a dubious word in journalism right now, but my sources for the beatings in Iraq were impeccable. But they were Iraqi, you see. Iraqi sources say they didn't have any imprimatur on. Now it was happening at US military bases all over Iraq. Torture works, an American Special Forces colonel boasted to a friend of mine 2 months ago. He was wrong. Torture creates resistance. Torture creates suicide bombers. Torture ends up by destroying the torturers. I remember the village of Khandari, where the first American to be blown up by a roadside bomb was killed in July of 2003. When I got there, his blood was still across the highway and the crowd were gloating over his death. And a man walked up to me who wanted to talk politics of a very violent kind. He had, he said, been a prisoner of the Americans and savagely beaten. This is the way we deal with occupiers, he said. They came and said they were liberators, but when we realized they were occupiers, we had to fight. We are people of steel. The Americans and all the other occupiers will burn. Then he said something as chilling as it was terrible. I have a 1-year-old daughter, he said, and I would happily put a bomb in her clothes and send her to the Americans to kill them. I did ask him why he wouldn't do it himself. The Americans and British, of course, have benefited from all these accounts of terror under Saddam. True accounts. Would you rather he was still here in Iraq, torturing and gassing his own people? That's what we'd say to the Iraqis. Do you remember that line in Animal Farm? You don't want Mr. Smith back, do you? Bah. That's what we want the Iraqis to do, you see. Don't you think we did a good thing by getting rid of Saddam? Answer that question on ABC. I've had to do that, by the way. All this because the original reasons for the invasion, Saddam's possession of weapons of mass destruction, his links with the outrages of September 11th, 2001, Blair's 45-minute warning, turned out to be lies. But it was a dark comparison that Bush and Blair were making. If Saddam's immorality and wickedness had to be the tuning fork against which all our iniquities were judged, what did that say about us? If Saddam's regime was to be the moral compass to define our actions, how bad, how iniquitous did that allow us to be? Saddam tortured and executed women in Abu Ghraib. We only sexually abused prisoners and killed a few of them and murdered some suspects in Bagram and subjected them to inhuman treatment in Guantanamo. We're not as bad as Saddam. Saddam was much worse. And thus it became inevitable that the symbol of Saddam's shame, the prison at Abu Ghraib, subsequently became the symbol of our shame too. What was interesting was the vastly different reactions in East and West to our abuses at Abu Ghraib. We civilized Westerners, we were shocked at the dog-biting and humiliation and torture our men and women inflicted on the inmates. Iraqis were outraged but not shocked. Their friends and relatives, some of whom had been locked up by the Americans, had long ago told them of the revolting behaviour of the American guards. They weren't surprised by these iconic photographs that we saw. They already knew. They thought that's how we always behaved. In Baghdad, this January last, I walked to the voting booths with whole Iraqi families, men with babies in their arms, children with their mothers, as the air pulsated to the sound of the day's first suicide bombers. Boom, boom, you can hear it in your bedroom in the morning. 7 o'clock they start. It was a moving experience. Rarely do you see collective courage on this scale. And an Iraqi government was formed, of course, of sorts, dominated for the first time by the country's Shia Muslims, but flawed by the one phenomenon which undermined their legitimacy, the continued American occupation. In the polling stations, many of the families told us they were voting for power, for the Shiites, of course, but also for an end to the occupation. And the occupation was not going to end. The Americans must leave, I used to say to myself, and they will leave, but they can't leave. And that is the terrible equation that has turned sand into blood. The Americans insisted they wanted democracy across the Middle East, and Iraq would be the start. But what Arab nation wanted to join the hell disaster, to quote Churchill on Palestine, that Iraq has now become? Yes, Arabs want some of that bright, shining democracy, which we like to brandish in front of them. They'd like a couple of packets of human rights and 3 boxes of rights for women too. But I think the Arabs wanted something else. They wanted justice, a setting to rights, a peaceful but an honourable fair end to the decades of occupation and deceit and corruption and dictator creation. The Iraqis wanted an end to our presence as well as an end to Saddam's regime. They wanted to control their own land and own their own oil. The Syrians wanted Golan back. The Palestinians wanted a state, even if it was built on less than 20% of Mandate Palestine, not a 20-foot wall and occupation. The Iranians had freed themselves from the Shah, America's brutal policeman in the Gulf, only to find themselves living in a graveyard of theocracy, their democratic elections betrayed by men who feed off the hatred for America that now lies like a blanket over the Middle East. The Afghans resisted the Soviet Union, as we asked them to, and wanted us to help restore their country, and they were betrayed by us again and finished in the hands of the Taliban until another great army came to bombard them and finish their land. However much the newly installed rulers and the old surviving dictators whom we had helped to power over past decades praised the West, or thanked us for our financial loans, or thanked us for our political support, or thanked us for invading their countries, there were millions of Muslims who wanted something more. They wanted, I think, freedom from us. We might be able to escape history. We can draw neat lines. 1918, end of the First World War. OK, Versailles, 1919, problem. 1945, the end of the dictatorships of the world. Finish with Japan, finish with Italy, and finish with Nazi Germany. We can start again. We think we can recommend the same to the peoples of the Middle East. But we can't. History, a history of injustice, cloaks them too deeply. Albert Camus, the Pied Noir who understood colonial oppression in Algeria all too vividly, wrote just after the Second World War that it is true that we cannot escape history, since we're in it up to our necks, but one may propose to fight within history to preserve from history that part of man which is not its proper province. Modern nations are driven by powerful forces along the roads of power and domination. They hardly need our help, and for the moment they laugh at attempts to hinder them. They will then continue. But I will ask only this simple question: what if these forces wind up in a dead end? What if that logic of history, on which so many now rely, turns out to be a will-o'-the-wisp? T.S. Eliot, of all people, writing in the same year, 1946, addressed history with equal cynicism. Justice itself tends to be corrupted by political passion, and that meddling in other people's affairs, which was formerly conducted by the most discreet intrigue, is now openly advocated under the name of intervention. Nations which once shrank from condemning the most terrible violation of human rights in Germany are now exhorted to interfere in other countries' government, and always in the name of peace and concord. Respect for the culture, the pattern of life of other people is respect for history, and by history we set no great store. So have these people all died for history then? The thousands of dead, let me be frank with myself, whom I have seen with my own eyes across the Middle East? The dead soldier with the bright wedding ring on his finger, the slaughtered masses of Sabra Shatila, the Iranians putrefying in the desert, the Israelis blown to pieces by suicide bombers outside a pizzeria in Jerusalem, the corpses of Palestinians and Israelis and Lebanese and Syrians and Afghans, the unspeakable suffering of the Iraqi, Iranian, Syrian, Lebanese, Afghan, Israeli, and yes, American torture chambers. Was this for history? Was this for justice? Or for us? We know that the Balfour Declaration was made 88 years ago. The declaration which gave Britain support for a Jewish home in Palestine, but though, of course, there will be nothing damaged of the Arab rights of those who live there. But for Palestinian refugees in the slums of their camps in Sabra Shatila, which is just a mile from my home in Beirut, Lord Balfour spoke yesterday, last night, only an hour ago. In the Middle East, the people live their past history again and again every day. I think in the end, we have to accept that our tragedy lies always in our past, that we have to live with our ancestors' folly and suffer for it, just as they in their turn suffer, and as we in our turn are making the next generation suffer now. How to correct history, that's the thing. Well, all I can say is, as I've been writing my book, I've heard each evening the footfall of my father on November the 11th, 1918, marching with soldiers of the King's Liverpool Regiment into the small village of Louvencourt on the Somme. That's where it started. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
That's Robert Fisk, and this is Alternative Radio. I'm David Barsamian. This edition of AR features Robert Fisk, Dateline Beirut. I talked with him in Beirut in early April 2005. Welcome to the program, Robert Fisk.
Thank you, David.
Well, to start off, we're just a few blocks from the site of the St. George Hotel where on February 14th, former Lebanese Premier Rafik Hariri was assassinated. And since then, a series of events have evolved here in Lebanon. Can you briefly encapsulate the significance of Hariri's assassination and what's ensued?
Well, the principal significance for Lebanon is that he made himself, and never groomed a successor, he made himself Lebanon. He became the symbol because of his enormous wealth. He was in Forbes' top 100 richest man. He made himself the symbol of Lebanon's recovery after the Civil War, which of course ended in 1990 after 15 years of fighting. And it was principally his existence and his presence in this country which enabled constant loans to be furnished to Lebanon, that brought in investors, that brought in at least 1 million Arab tourists every summer. They all fled now, of course. He was, therefore, the underpinning of the Lebanese economy and state. And his departure put an immediate, tremendous blow on the economy of this country. If you look around downtown, it's empty. People are frightened of the bombs that have been going off, the fourth, of course, last night. And this country has a $33 billion debt. Don't ask me how they spent it, but they did. And I can't see how they're going to sustain that, and indeed how they're even going to be able to service the interest on that huge debt after Hariri's gone. So fundamentally, his death and the bombings, though comparatively mild in terms of casualties that have succeeded, have struck a body blow, if not a fatal body blow, at the economy of this country. And that, presumably, is what the enemies of Lebanon, or the enemies of Hariri, wanted to do. The immediate aftermath, of course, of Hariri's death were these huge demonstrations, both by pro-Syrian groups, primarily the Hizbollah, and by the opposition, as they call themselves, which are Sunni Muslim, Druze, and Christian Maronite, who managed to get 1 million people together. That's almost a third of the population of Lebanon in one demonstration last month. Very impressive. Fortunately for the opposition, they had made their alliance, Sunni, Druze and Christian, before Hariri's assassination. I don't know if they succeeded in doing so in the aftermath of it, but Hariri was certainly seen as the key figure behind the alliance against the Syrians. And the Syrians certainly suspected that through Hariri's personal friendship with Jacques Chirac, that he primarily brought about UN Resolution 1559, which calls for a total Syrian military withdrawal from Lebanon.
Now, Hariri, when he was assassinated, did not hold political office.
No, he had already resigned because President Lahoud, who is Syria's most faithful friend in Lebanon, had managed to persuade the parliament, which was stacked with Syria's friends, to go round the constitution and give him another 3 years in office. The relationship between Hariri and Lahoud was always pretty bad. They didn't like each other personally. And so Hariri had deliberately left office and planned to win these upcoming elections if they take place. He thought he could effectively outmaneuver the pro-Syrians in the parliament and actually establish an independent Lebanese government.
Syria first entered Lebanon in 1976. Well, one could say that Lebanon is Syria. In fact, before I came here, I was looking at my father's passport, 1921, and it was stamped for Beirut, Syria.
If you go to the antiquarian bookshop up here on the hill behind my home, you'll find lots of postcards showing Beirut Port, Syria. Of course, what happened is that when the French mandate was declared after the Treaty of Versailles, and the French arrived in Lebanon, they decided to carve Lebanon out of Syria. This was part of the Mahafazat, the governorate of Syria. So Syrians, of course, look back and say that this is territory that was taken from them by foreigners, which is technically true. And it's also, of course, an artificial country, based as it is by the mutual love and mutual fear and mutual suspicion of all the various different ethnic and religious groups here. But the French did indeed create Lebanon. But the Syrians, who came in 76 at the request of a Christian Maronite president, who thought the Palestinians were going to wipe out the Christians, they've now stayed longer than the French did after the First World War. The Syrian mandate has lasted almost a quarter of a century. More than a quarter of a century, which is more than you can say for the French, who at least were pushed out eventually by the Brits.
How many Palestinians are in Lebanon, and in what circumstances did they arrive here?
How many are here? Officially, we are told there are 370,000 here. The Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the DFLP, which is a leftist organisation, has done a number of surveys which suggest that, in fact, there's only about 170,000 here, that the other 200,000 have drifted off to Syria, Europe, they've got citizenship in America. They, or their parents, or their grandparents, originally came to the camps here from what is now northern Israel. They came from Galilee. And they will all, even small children, tell you what is their home village. They, of course, were part of the great exodus of Palestinians at the time of the creation of the Israeli state. As you realize, Palestinians driven out of what became southern Israel ended up in Gaza. Those from the Jerusalem area ended up, if they didn't manage to stay in their homes, in the West Bank. And, of course, the ones in the north came into Lebanon. And when they came here, of course, they believed they were here for a few days until the war ended, and they would go back to their homes in Palestine, as they saw it. And, of course, they never were permitted to go back. They don't have that right of return. They may think they have it, but they don't actually have it. And so they fester on in the camps here, not permitted to have work, not permitted to have Lebanese passports. They have laissez-passer. And they live in great squalor and great unhappiness. They were not even allowed to vote in the recent Palestinian elections. Iraqis abroad could vote in the Iraqi elections, but not the Palestinians, you see, an interesting little gap there. And so they remain here, and during the war, of course, when Lebanon fractured apart, although initially he was doing his best to keep out of it, Arafat's Fatah ended up, naturally enough, on the Muslim leftist side in the war, fighting the Christians. And then, of course, their sorry story continues with the tragedy of the Sabra and Shatila massacre by Israel's Phalangist allies in 1982, the camps war in which even more Palestinians were killed in that massacre by Shiite Muslim militiamen of Amal, run by the now Speaker of Parliament, Nabi Berri. And they continue to live in great squalor in the camps today.
And referring to Sabra and Shatila, there's a connection with then General Ariel Sharon.
Well, very much so. Ariel Sharon, of course, who's now the Prime Minister of Israel, was the defense minister. He gave the orders to send the Phalangists into the camp, allegedly to round up terrorists. Of course, they weren't terrorists, they were innocent people, and they were all 1,700 killed. What has not had much light shed upon it is that the night before the Sabra and Shatila massacre began, before the Phalangists were sent in, Ariel Sharon made a statement saying that the Phalangist leader, Bashir Gemayel, who was president-elect and who was assassinated in a bombing, had been killed by Palestinians, by Palestinian terrorists, which was totally untrue. So those Phalangists not only were sent into the camp on the specific orders of Ariel Sharon, where, as I say, in all they murdered up to 1,700 innocent Palestinians, they also went in with Sharon's words ringing in their ears that Palestinians had killed their leader, which was untrue.
I always shudder when I hear the word complicated ascribed to a situation in the Middle East. But it seems that in the case of Lebanon, at least through the lens of most Americans, the situation is rather complicated with the different confessions, with the fact that certain government positions are reserved for different religious communities. That gives it an extraordinary flavor that I don't know replicates itself anywhere in the region.
I don't think Lebanon is complicated. I think that's a myth proposed by journalists who don't understand it, or by politicians who want to avoid discussing it. Look, when this country was created by the French, the largest single community were the Christian Maronites. And they pressed to have the largest possible area of Syria turned into Lebanon. But the Christians were quickly outbred by the Muslims. So the largest community now are the Shia Muslims, the second is the Sunnis, and then the Christians, and then the Druze, and then all kinds of small, the Armenians, for example, would be one of the smaller groups. In order to sustain what is an artificially created state, the French decided to have a system of power sharing. The president would always be a Christian Maronite. The prime minister would always be a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of parliament would always be a Shiite. And throughout the main institutions of state, the ministries, for example, the central bank, they were distributed roughly in accordance with what the ethnic groups were in 1932, Christians, Muslims, and Druze. Now, what's happened is that the last census taken here was 1932. No one dares to have another census in case it rocks the boat. So we have to go on pretending that the Christians are the largest group, even though they're not. At the end of the Civil War, it was decided to try and change the sectarian system. But in fact, all it did was take a little bit of power away from the Christian president and give a little bit more power to the Sunni Muslim prime minister. It didn't effectively the system of sectarianism. And the real problem, you see, when you have a country where you cannot become the president unless you're a Christian, and you cannot become the prime minister unless you're a Sunni Muslim, and you cannot become the speaker of parliament, though I don't know who'd ever want to be the speaker of parliament in Lebanon, unless you're a Shiite Muslim, you have an intuitively artificial state which cannot be a modern state. It cannot grow up, it cannot mature, because all these various groups live in mutual suspicion of each other, making sure, hold on a second, there's two Druzes in that ministry, there are three ministers in this institution, but only two of them are Christian, and so on and so forth. And so the system that was worked out by the French meant that Lebanon would intrinsically be a weak country. The strange thing about Lebanon is that its people have learned from their experience. They learned to fight and die, which they could never have. This is a country which is very corrupt and which people love enjoying themselves. This is a country of fine wines and beautiful women and restaurants. And yet, it was the only country that's ever been able to defeat the Israelis. They drove them out eventually in 2000, Hezbollah and other groups. A very dangerous country to meddle in. The American Marines were blown up here, 241 US personnel killed, October 23rd, 1982. The French were blown up here. Even the United Nations has a sorry record in southern Lebanon. Very dangerous country, very deceptive. When you arrive here from Europe, it's the beginning of the Middle East. You smell the nargila, hubble-bubble pipes, and you walk on the Corniche and see the palm trees. When you come from further east, from Iraq or from Iran or Afghanistan, it's the beginning of the West. I can buy my newspaper here. I can drink a gin and tonic before my meal in the evening. So it has this very attractive personality as a state. Partly, I think, because the Lebanese have always retained their sense of humour. Partly, too, because they've begun now to learn what they did to themselves in the Civil War, which was an act of total folly and madness. I watched it all. And the most impressive thing at the moment, and it's a great tribute to Rafik Hariri, is that since his death, there has not been, despite the provocations, there has not been any sign of an incipient civil war. Two reasons for this. One is, I think, the Lebanese don't want another war. They've had war. 15 years was a long time, a lot of death, 150,000 dead. And the other reason is that during the war, many Lebanese families who could afford it sent their children to be educated abroad. They went to New York, Boston, London, Geneva. And many of them come back. And they don't like the way this country is run. They think it's antique, one of them said to me the other day. But they like Lebanon, and they don't want a war. They see no point at all, and they're absolutely not interested in sectarianism. And that is the greatest hope I've seen since Hariri was murdered.
We're speaking in early April 2005, and while I've been in the country, a very high State Department official has been visiting a congressional delegation. What kind of interference have you perceived by the United States in the domestic situation in Lebanon?
Look, the real question that the opposition are asking themselves in private here, the people who are opposed to the Syrians, is do the Americans really want a working democracy in Lebanon? Or is their support for freedom, democracy, liberty, you name it, in fact part of a neo-conservative project which will be finalized when, in a free and independent Lebanon, the United States ambassador visits the president of Lebanon and says, well, how about a peace treaty with Israel? Is that what this is really about? You see, in the run-up to the murder of Hariri, the pro-Syrian politicians, who of course included the then Prime Minister Omar Karami and the President of the Hood, were openly saying to people like Walid Jumblat and, by inference, to Rafik Hariri, you're working Israel's policies for them. That is what this is about. We're talking about UN Resolution 1559 to get the Syrians out. And certainly I know in private, because I talked to all of them, the senior members of the opposition are very worried that America is much less interested in democracy as it is shoring up another Israeli bulwark to the northern border of Israel, and effectively, you see, by disarming the Hezbollah, which is also part of the UN resolution, there will be no active force capable of resisting any kind of interference in Lebanon's internal affairs. And that would be, and that's one reason why the opposition are saying, look, we understand what the UN resolution says, but for the moment we're going to look after the resistance movement. That's what Bahia Hariri, the sister of Rafik Hariri, said at this big demonstration. So the Hezbollah, once the Syrians are out, the Americans will put the spotlight on the Hezbollah. And that will then become a very dangerous situation, because most Lebanese, with a few opposition exceptions like Amin Jamal, who doesn't really count, are not interested in disarming the Hezbollah. They say, look, you know, when the war is over, it's over, and that means nobody will carry weapons. At the moment, we know Hezbollah are still carrying out operations in Sheba Farms, which was originally part of Lebanon, but which Israel continues to occupy as part of its occupation of Syria, claiming it is part of Syria.
I just spent a few days in Syria myself, and people were asking me, well, you know, what are this UN resolutions? What about the Golan Heights? What about Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights? Why isn't that being discussed?
Well, we know the reason it's not being discussed, because American foreign policy in the Middle East has never been so skewed towards Israel and against the Arabs as it is now. That's bad for the Arabs, it's actually bad for the Israelis, and it's very bad for the United States, but the policy is being ruthlessly pursued by Bush and his friends. The Americans brand this the Cedar Revolution. This was a State Department phrase, by the way, it wasn't a Lebanese phrase. But the Americans don't understand what's happening here. These were not demonstrations for democracy, though they'd like quite a bit of democracy if you could give it to the Lebanese, please. This was an insurrection against the corruption of government here. It was an insurrection against the way in which there is no real freedom of speech in Parliament, because it's weighted down with pro-Syrian MPs. It was not a demand for democracy per se. People were saying, enough. They weren't saying freedom, freedom. They'd like freedom. We'd all like some freedom. I'd like to have more freedom in Lebanon. But it has been misinterpreted in the West as part of this great domino effect of democracy, which is allegedly bursting out all over the place. But it's not. There isn't such an effect at all. But this is how the legend, the narrative is being written. And by misreading what's happening in Lebanon, the Americans will make more mistakes here. And they're using what is happening in Lebanon for their own project and possibly for an Israeli project. And that's the real tragedy, because people here deserve better than that.
Israel invaded first in 1978, but then in 1982 remained in the country until 2000. And Hezbollah is given credit for forcing Israel out of Lebanon. Is that, do you think that's accurate?
Well, the Israeli military officers, whom I've since met in Israel, believe that is basically accurate, yes. Hezbollah believe it's accurate. I'm not going to disagree with both the Israelis and the Hezbollah. Look, Hezbollah, like so many of the armed groups in this region, was Israel's creation. Just as Israel openly encouraged Hamas in the Gaza Strip when it thought it could destroy the PLO, this is all before Oslo, of course, by doing so. When it came here, the ferocity of the invasion, 82, drove people who were not deeply religious into seeing Islam as the only way of leading their life if they were going to seriously oppose Israel's military force. I remember, as the Israelis stormed up towards Beirut, being on a beach down at Halde, about 4 miles south of here, and suddenly seeing these young men with yellow and green bandanas running towards an Israeli tank, holding Kalashnikovs and shooting. shouting, Allah Akbar, Allah Akbar, God is great, God is great. And to my astonishment, they captured the tank and an armoured personnel carrier, and the crew fled into a school shooting. And they then drove the vehicle into Beirut. And I said to myself, who in hell are these people? I've never seen anything like this. I mean, I was, frightened for my life at the time, but I saw what was happening. And this was actually the first Hezbollah. This was the creation of Hezbollah on the beach of Halde. Of course, I've met many thousands of Hezbollah fighters, and they have all agreed this was indeed the first Hezbollah creation. This was the moment. So I saw it. I saw the birth of it. And from that moment onwards, Hezbollah became an organization of great importance in Lebanon, a key player, as you'd say in your American academic world. It was the only real resistance movement against the Israelis. There was Amal, but it could often be a sandbag for the Israelis as well. And the Lebanese army, as usual, of course, did nothing. They didn't fight the Israeli invasion. So Hezbollah, in a sense, won its spurs, to use that old cliche. It is, the Americans say, it is the most powerful terrorist movement in the world. Well, whether you want to use the word terrorist or not, it's certainly, I think, the most disciplined guerrilla movement in the world. Much more disciplined, for example, than the insurgency in Iraq, although that, of course, is on a much bigger scale. Needless to say, the Hezbollah are watching the insurgency in Iraq with great interest to see how the Americans respond and to see how the insurgency is developing. You see, they realize, of course, that just as when they were fighting the Israelis, they had a longer-term objective, which was to play a role in Lebanese politics later. We freed the country, we have a right, you see. So they realize, which the Americans do not, that the insurgents in the Sunni areas of Iraq have a longer-term aim than just getting rid of the Americans. It is to be able to say afterwards, we got rid of the Americans, so the Sunnis do have a right to power in Iraq. And the Shiites did not fight the Americans, you see. And of course the Hezbollah see this, they can work it out. And the Americans, again, don't do so. They won't look at the day after tomorrow, only today and tonight. Short term, short term, short term. That's why they're in this mess in Iraq in the first place.
Sheikh Nasrallah, in a recent statement, said he would welcome the U.S. military in Lebanon. Is this just some rhetorical, bravura, or is it?
Yes, I think what he's doing is sending a message to the Americans that if they want to take on the Hezbollah, they'll have to come back and go through what they went through in 1983, more bloodshed. And he knows very well that the Americans have no stomach for yet another insurgency on their hands. Iraq is quite enough. But yes, it's rhetoric. This is the kind of language that resistance groups in the Middle East regularly. It's the sort of thing that Arafat used to say over and over again until we fell asleep listening to it. But the fact that it's the Hezbollah leader that says it is a little bit more serious.
And in addition to having this military formation, it is providing certain services to the Shia South, which have, if I could say, have traditionally been emiserated, live in poverty, not the recipient of a lot of government services. So they're able to build up a real community. That's my sense of it.
Look, there's no doubt that if you look at Parliament here now, the most hard-working MPs, without doubt, are the Hezbollah ones. They're men from poor backgrounds, not the rich elite, Zoama, the aristocratic classes that you've got behind the feudal lords who run much of the Parliament. And there's no doubt that the repair of roads, the reinstallation of phone lines, the clean water that's been laid on into many villages is a result of Hezbollah money, which is Iranian money, of course. The Iranians are looking after their Shiites in Lebanon. That's what we're talking about here. Another interesting question with Hezbollah, you see, is if they break with Syria, can they keep their links with Iran? The answer is probably yes, certainly financially. I don't know about in terms of weapons. But there are plenty of weapons in this country anyway. This business about disarmament, no one's been disarmed. Every house here has a Kalashnikov in, just in case the war restarts.